Howdy, you delicious people. I'm here today to review Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original film. Ultimately, reasonably, little issues here and there with the internet today and the Wi Fi today, so hopefully I'm able to actually get this out. But yeah, so let's talk about this movie and let's talk about it in a very cryptic like sense, do a double five eventually, and then go into spoilers about this movie. So, ultimately within this film, I think it's still, in my eyes, probably the best team movie because one, it ultimately tries to be its own via the original source material. It kind of grounds itself where the original cartoon uh, kind of does a lot of extravagant esh like things. And I think within this movie, it's good to be 100% a team movie that is 100% a team thing from the get go. Where every other thing you have to eventually gain members as it goes along, and then eventually that's when you eventually come to a consensus that it is a team at some points. So going into this movie, reasonably there is some very good things that it does compared to the cartoon. I am probably only 2 seasons into the cartoon, and eventually I really want to forcibly watch season 3 because realizing that somewhere down the road within this season, I think there's a episode specifically for Casey Jones, so I can ultimately see that character origin story through the cartoon, which is going to be good. I hope and I believe, because I don't remember, because my life is a blur. Going into this movie, I think my huge hesitation about watching this film back was because throughout the entire movie, I could memorize all of the lines. Like, I knew all of the lines as they were coming. And so I was like, how many times did I watch this movie as a kid? Because I was like, I don't know, this movie to me, or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in general, is kind of a big blur to me. Like, I don't remember if I had seen a lot of the cartoon or not. I don't remember how many times I watched the movies or not. Maybe just the very first film is kind of easy to memorize all the lines. I don't know, but so ultimately, at some points, I'm probably going to talk about the lines, or there's sometimes where I will probably um, just kind of get the review kind of quickly go through and not have to go through every little detail about the film at some points. But it's always kind of interesting to ultimately know the address of 122 and an 8 for for the Pizza Man, or to ultimately know April O'Neil's record was 107, a new record, and this and that, and it's kind of funny to kind of go into this and remember some of the things that I always kind of quote back to people all the time. Um, like, something much worse will come for you. Or when you die, it will. Some classic lines, some very fun lines. Overall, I still think that this movie is really fun, and really, I think it still has the best Casey Jones. And I know there had been some other actors and stuff like that that had approached this movie and done a Casey Jones, like Stephen Amell had done Casey Jones in a live action movie. Chris Evans had done the voice of Casey Jones in the TMNT movie, which is actually a pretty good film if you haven't seen it. Ultimately, I do know the original April Neil, the actress that played the very first April O'Neil is doing a YouTube channel as like a reflection on the Ninja Turtles movies, and like she's really pulling some of the stuntmen. She's really kind of doing kind of a bunch of interviews and parties and stuff like that. A lot of like live stream esh like get-togethers, which looks kind of fun. So that exists out in the world, which is kind of interesting to see her kind of interview people or her like get to like get back into knowing some people and stuff like that, which is kind of fun going into this. So yeah, my big hesitation was really just memorizing most of the lines as I was watching this movie. Like every single line, I knew uh, what was coming up. Like, don't tell me how to do my jab, or or like, are you busting my chops? And all these lines, all these little tiny lines that for somehow or another, like I knew what were coming up bizarrely. Um, but yeah, they're always really fun. Like this movie's always really fun to watch. You could watch it another 100 times, and like yeah, like I knew all the lines bizarrely, so it kind of took me out of the experience. But it's still a fun film. It still holds up. At some points, there are some movie references in this movie that, and there are some kind of times where you can see the transitions between stunt turtle and close up turtle, or and I always kind of find it fascinating on whether or not you would have it to where is it a guy just in a voice over studio like regaling all the lines? Is it the people like are the people actually doing the lines in the costume, or are they off somewhere and reasonably just mouthing over the lines somewhere else? That's what I always found fascinating. It's like, was it done after the fact, or was it actually done? Did the actual guys who actually voiced the people actually go in and actually wear the suits? That's my fascination about things, is like figuring that out. Which more than likely, probably a lot of the people probably didn't. Um, but then again, maybe some of the people came back from, I don't know. I want to figure that out now, because that's my next question to eventually figure out in the ether. Which I think there's probably an entire movie somewhere where it's like behind the scenes of the whole thing of how they did it. I don't think that there was an actual featurette like thing of something showcasing that in the original like DVD thing that I got. Maybe there's probably a Blu-ray thing of it somewhere where ultimately you get to see a lot more, or maybe there's an entire certain kind of thing that you can go into to just watch behind the scenes. But I don't know. I just thought it was reasonably just kind of like interesting to see how exactly they approach this movie, because this movie looks very complicated. And not only that, but you have to have like stuntmen also do all these flips and stuff like that, and do all these things in costume, which looks very difficult. So going into this movie, yeah, there are like it becomes its own thing because recently it retcons and changes some things, I think, for the better. I think reasonably I would like to take the movie origin or the movie approach and like fuse it into the cartoon somehow, to where it's just like, okay, like I don't like what happens to Splinter in the cartoon. I don't like what happens um, to Shredder right away in the cartoons. I don't like how you don't have enough. of the Foot Clan in the cartoons. I wish there were more Foot Clan in the cartoons because I only saw like one episode of the Foot Clan actually like in the episode for like 2 seasons, the first 2 seasons. God, I gotta get into that third season so I can watch Casey Jones. Watch it forcibly. I gotta figure out some way of time to ultimately just like it's gonna have to get to a point where I'm gonna have to side by side like freaking like I'm gonna have to watch something that I want to watch uh like side by side. I'm gonna have to have two devices, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna be watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in one hand, and then I'm gonna be watching like whatever the heck else that I want to watch in another hand, and simultaneously just kind of like watch both of these things so I can keep track of both things simultaneously. Because I think one might just be on for background noise at some point, so I can watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the third season. So let's go into spoilers about this review because ultimately it's probably me talking about a lot of tangents. And so, yeah, let's get into that double five time territory and let's talk about this movie. Ultimately, for this one, I don't really understand how April O'Neil is a reporter because she could just probably retire right now and be a billionaire or millionaire, um, which ultimately I think at a lot of points she probably could. Maybe I guess reporting for her is a fun thing because ultimately she must have a ton of money lying around. I guess because I guess I don't know during this time period when exactly how much money a reporter earns, but anyways, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I can do spoil this movie. So ultimately, right away, April O'Neil is talking about a a silent crime wave, a band of ninja thieves, and we ultimately get a bunch of scenarios where we're seeing like a UPS guy deliver something from some truck, and the delivery man goes back to his truck, and the truck is empty. We ultimately have a old lady that is ultimately getting her TV swiped, and the old woman's like, "Hey, you took my TV and whatever." So we get this silent time crime wave going on, and so eventually we have it to where we have April, who is ultimately after her report is done. She is, of course, going to her van. She's going to her van to go home. So ultimately, we are having her walk alone at night to meet two to three hooligans. Ultimately, one of the hooligans is Sam Rockwell, which ultimately we of course know from Iron Man 2s and everything like that. More than likely, you barely see him in this scene, but the most notable part is when you see him where he ultimately tells us, anything you want to do it. He's that guy. Ultimately, he has two different kind of cigarettes and stuff like that. So a bulk of the time he keeps reappearing in this movie at certain point in junctures because I guess there was only a couple different actors that they could ultimately use in this movie. But I think if you actually look fairly closely through a number of the extras they use in both of these films, and especially the first two films, there is a lot of pretty well known actors that I think get mixed up at some point in these movies. Ultimately, I think in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the guy that ultimately plays in the very first Spawn movie with John Leguizamo, he is actually in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 as one of the Foot Clan that is ultimately or a person that is going to join the Foot Clan and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2. I think in this movie we have Sam Rockwell, and I think we also have the guy that plays Billy in the movie Scream. or also he was in the show Jericho. I think he is also in the background of one of these scenes somewhere. So some fairly iconic characters, you can kind of quickly catch them in some backgrounds of the scenes. But mood point. So ultimately, we have April that is going to be uh, running for her life at some point, and ultimately, three of the hooligans are, of course, screaming, "Get her purse! Get her purse!" Ultimately, one hooligan mentions "Got her watch," and that's when lights go out and the turtles kick butt, and then ultimately Mikey says, "Whoa!" and then cue the lights, cue the police driving through, and ultimately realizing that these guys are all tied up, and April is grabbing a sigh and putting it in her purse. Ultimately, Raph is noticing this, and he is, of course, saying his line that he basically says through a bulk of this movie, "Damn." And then that's when you get the Ninja Turtles music, and that's when you get to where the guys are ultimately saying at some point, "Yeah, we kicked butt tonight," and basically they throw in the Major League Butt Kicking is back in town. Ooh, yeah, and that's when you, of course, get the title screen. You get Leonardo jumping into fray. Ultimately, I don't quite know if the actual shadows match up with the actual with them actually jumping into frame at some point, but I guess it's quasi close. So here's where, at first point, we get the whole like battling of trying to figure out what is the latest or greatest catchphrase. We of course get radicals, and then eventually we get into where eventually we have Donnie, who of course usually messes up the catchphrases. Ultimately, he says, I believe in this one, he says Bossa Nova, and then he's like Chevy Nova, and they eventually transition into Wicked. Um, and because ultimately, again, Donnie always messes up the catchphrases. I think in the sequel, I think he goes with Frere Jacques, and ultimately they're always like, Donnie, give it up. So we still have Raph again, of course, saying his classic catchphrase that he has to consistently say throughout this movie, "Damn!" And so they eventually turn tail and ultimately go into Splinter. Ultimately, saying that they fought well, they were many, but he kicked. Were you seen? Um, because in this you have to master the art of invisibility, uh, this and that. We ultimately get to a point where eventually, at some point, Raph ultimately mentions that he lost a sigh, uh, and Splinter says they'll get it back. Um, and ultimately, we have Mikey eventually ordering pizza. Eventually, ordering pizza and saying that he wants no anchovies. If you put anchovies on that, in this and that, so we eventually have Splinter kind of really trying to bring everything back to focus, mentioning that to have them use his teachings wisely, for they are young now, but eventually, uh, at some point, Splinter will be gone, and this and that. So basically, while Mikey is waiting for his pizza with no anchovies, Splinter is telling all of the turtles to meditate on everything now. So basically, what Mikey, of course, considers meditation is musicianship. Putting on da 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 ninjutsu da 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 Hava Nagila, or what was the Pee Wee song? Um, anyways, and then ultimately Michelangelo says, "Well, it's like meditating," and so all the turtles are dancing, and Splinter's like, "Ugh." So we we ultimately see a consistent pattern of Raphael putting on a an overcoat and a Indiana Jones Eshley hat, and he's leaving. Ultimately, Leo asks like where he's going out. So Raph ends up going out to eventually bump into him just wanting to just uh still kind of fight crime for the night. Bumps into, of course, two purse snatchers, knocks them over, and eventually, when they get to him or think they're going to attack him, he ultimately points to his one Sai. They ultimately just start running away to run in the arms of, who would you think? Casey Jones. Ultimately, he is telling them, your instructor tonight is Casey Jones. 2 minutes for slashing, 2 minutes for hooking, and 2 minutes for high sticking. And so eventually, Raph jumps in and ultimately uh, confronts him. And this is probably the most fun in this movie, to have it to where, like, yeah, you get a little bit of the turtles, but I think this is the most fun going on in this movie, where you ultimately have Casey Jones that is in full Casey Jones gear, and you have like Raph in his disguise, justifiably like going up against Casey Jones, and it's a really fun exchange here. We have a really fun amount of things going on here with the Jose Canseco bat, which ultimately I realized now watching this movie a different exchange than I remember before. So we have it to where Raph comes in and ultimately now wants to fight Casey Jones, and because he's ultimately telling him it's like to not fight them like that. Um, and so reasonably, since Casey Jones is like, well, hey, like, how about I kind of just uh fight you now now that like it seems like you're like, he ultimately tells him that it's like, hey, it's good that you did your job there, but now this is my time. This is my time with these geeks. But Raph won't let it go, so ultimately it's like, okay, well, all right, well, let's fight it out. Let's go with this. So eventually, uh, Casey swings his bat. Raph catches it and ultimately notices it's a Jose Canseco bat. Tell me you didn't pay money with this, and ultimately he says it's a cigarette, and then ultimately he says it was like a 2-for-1 sale, which I ultimately didn't realize he said before. And so ultimately we have this fight out, and like it's from eventually just kind of two guys that are kind of too good, and eventually it gets to the point where Casey is just like, you know what, uh, how about I teach you cricket? And Raph is like, cricket? It's like, nobody understands cricket. If anything, you gotta know what a crumpet is before you can understand cricket. And so that's when, of course, Casey Jones smacks, of course, Raph and dumps him into the trash. And he ultimately says 6 runs, and then he runs away. And that's, of course, when Raph is running after him, eventually rolls off of a taxi cab that, of course, has one of the guys voiced inside, who does one of the voices for the actual movie. He is inside one of the cabs. And ultimately, the guy says, "Hey, what's that?" And ultimately, the cab driver says, "It looks like a turtle with a trench coat. You're going to LaGuardia, right?" So eventually, Raph is chasing after Casey, and he's ultimately saying, "Come back here. I'm not finished with you." And then ultimately, he screams out, of course, his usual line that he says throughout this entire movie. So Raph eventually comes home. Ultimately, Splinter waiting on him. To ultimately, like, Splinter is so, like, is trying to say this nicely, but Raph, of course, has so much anger, and, like, of course, Splinter is ultimately saying and telling, uh, like, Raph, it's like, that he has tried for so long to try to channel this anger, but more remains. Um, but then ultimately, when he's fighting all these enemies, to not forget, to forget his brothers, and also don't forget him, and ultimately that to remind him that, um, that he is here, my son, and this and that. Like, I would probably actually tell you exactly line for line what it is, but man, we're gonna go and fast forward through this. So eventually, we have to where, at some point, of course, April is like doing another news report, and she is, of course, this time around doing it on foot. Um, Ultimately mentioning about a an ancient Foot Clan and stuff like that, and to her ultimately, not only are the turtles watching, but then also Shredder is watching, and he's throwing a thing at some TV, and was ultimately saying, "Find her, silence her." So ultimately, we have, the Ninja Turtles that are also watching along as well, and they are eventually mentioning how she's a fox and she's a babe, and this and that. And we ultimately have Raph, who is eventually, again, at some point, going out to eventually find April. So April again is going out and eventually, going into the subway station this time around. And so eventually she is approached by the Foot. And ultimately, the Foot ultimately, tell her, "We've been waiting for you, Miss O'Neill." And she's like, "Oh, what am I, behind on my back taxes or something?" And ultimately, or something like that, some weird exchange. And ultimately, he says, "We have a message for you." and ultimately telling her to shut it. And she's like, "All right, that's it." And so that's why eventually we get it to where April tries to swing her purse with all the Foot Clan, and eventually they take her out. But eventually Raph comes in with both sides now that she had flung the Psy for him to grab. And so that's when, and that's when he starts beating up a lot of the Foot Clan, eventually grabbing April and bringing her back to the lair. The only problem with that is ultimately one of the Foot had followed him to said lair, and that begins a big problem later on. So here is again the next kind of fun part, because we get a kind of a transitional time where ultimately we have to kind of um, not only tell the re-origin story of the Turtles, and then eventually we'll get into the actual origin story of Splinter. But yeah, so we have April that ultimately is kind of knocked out, and she is in the lair of the Turtles, and ultimately um, they're asking Raph like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And ultimately, of course, they're asking if he's crazy or if he's lost his mind or whatever, and Raph is just like, "Yeah, like I'm crazy, I'm loony." It's like, if anything, I wanted to redecorate. I wanted to have a couple throw pillows, a TV news reporter. What do you think? And so eventually Splinter comes in, and eventually Raph ultimately says, "Hey, she was jumped on the subway. I had to take her here." And so Raph, of course, or Splinter, of course, says, "Bring water, cold washcloth, and this and that." And Michelangelo's far out. So eventually, cue April waking up to a rat kind of shaping her face with his fingers. And she, of course, wakes up and she's like, "Oh my god!" Like, "Who are you? Who are you?" And the turtles are like, "Ah," because they're scared of her. And ultimately, she is like, "Oh, I must be dreaming. I must be dreaming. That rat, I've seen him before." And then she's trying to come up with how she had seen any of the turtles, and then she's like, "You know what? I have no idea where you guys came from, huh?" So eventually, Splinter says, like, "Calm down. Like, I will explain everything, and this and that." So eventually, April talks about, "Why don't I dream about Harrison Ford," which I thought was kind of hilarious. So ultimately, we have to break into the story about uh, ultimately that Splinter had found four baby turtles, and that ultimately they had been surrounded by this ooze, and in this ooze container, and then eventually they had started to grow and then started to talk, and then eventually he had started to grow, and of course started to grow in intellect. And so eventually he starts, of course, getting to the point where um, he eventually showcases every single one of their names, of course, going with Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and then Raphael. And like in the second one, it's like all the good ones you had to know. And then Michelangelo gets ribbed for that, and eventually he has to do 10 flips now. But in this first one, not so much. So, anyways, we get it to where April is having all these guys come with her to her to her place, and ultimately she's living above a antique store that ultimately was previously owned by her father. And I'm like, again, why is April being a news reporter when she could just be an antique store owner? Okay, I guess that's just not a fledgling business that's working out well for her. But anyways, she lives above it, and so ultimately, via when ultimately the turtles are kind of following her out. Ultimately, basically, she's saying, "Well, the only convenient thing that I'd probably have for you guys to eat is frozen pizza." And immediately, the guys quickly lob out of the sewer, and they're like, "Let's go for it." And she's like, "What? You guys like frozen pizza?" And ultimately, Donatello said, "You said the magic word, pizza." So eventually she asks, like, "Well, hey, what do you like on your pizza?" And of course, Michelangelo jokingly says, flies, stink bugs. And then ultimately says it's a joke. So, cue Michelangelo, of course, being the comedian and having to do a bunch of impressions. Of course, he does Rocky, and then he does Cagney. And so they have an entire night of fun, but then they don't realize the Foot Clan being down by their lair and noticing exactly where they are. So we have it to where uh, we have it to where eventually Leonardo is telling April that he's like, hey, like, because ultimately Michelangelo does the you dirty rat" kind of thing, and April thinks that Splinter loves that joke, and everybody laughs. So basically, Leonardo says, "Hey, that's a reminder that ultimately we should head back home because Splinter worries." So they head back home to eventually find Splinter gone. So eventually, they go back to April and ultimately say that Splinter, they never really say he's gone, but we just have to naturally assume that at some point they said Splinter is gone. So they're all sad, they're all crappy because Splinter is gone because he's a cool rat. Um, and ultimately, here's a huge thing that I skipped. I skipped this entire thing because again, 122 and an 8. Um, I skipped the whole pizza part where Michelangelo is uh, getting pizza originally. I believe I entirely skipped that. I talked about it, but I didn't actually talk about that scene where ultimately Michelangelo and Donatello are both waiting for pizza, and ultimately uh, Donatello ultimately asks Michelangelo about like what he thinks about eventually like Splinter saying, about not having Splinter around. And immediately Michelangelo is only focused about food. Like he ultimately is only mentioning like pizza dude's got 30 seconds, and then eventually he goes, okay, time's up, $3 off. And then eventually they get to the pizza exchange to put it down here, and like that's eventually one. Yeah, that's kind of a wise men say forgiveness is divine, but never pay full price for late pizza. Yeah, I again probably didn't need to really throw that entire scene in there, but anyways, it's a funny thing to have like a address that would be extremely hard for a pizza man to find, um, which I'm assuming the pizza man would have probably given up at some point. So cue us getting back. to having April having all these turtles. And so reasonably we have it to where April has all of these turtles, and they're at her home. To where eventually we have it to where April's boss comes to her home and tells her that uh, that what she's doing, hey, like uh, that she that her report that she's doing, like, let somebody else work on it. Ultimately, he's telling her that she looks exhausted, that maybe she needs a break from the story, and all the while, basically, while this, while her boss is kind of um, going through her room, the Ninja Turtles were already once April told them to hide. They had already hid because they had heard somebody coming through her door, so they hid. And basically, some characters were better hiders than others because ultimately, uh, Danny had ultimately seen Michelangelo at some point. Eventually, we also get to see Danny at some points stealing some stuff. And eventually, we find Danny eventually having headphones that his father doesn't know where he got the headphones from. He sticks his head in those things. Don't know where he got them. But anyways, so eventually, April is talking about having to really needing to give some crap to Stern, which is this this head of the police department. And like, again, like, April's boss is like, take it easy. It's like, he ultimately has so many other people breathing down my neck. And so again, that's when April transitions about, hey Danny, how are you doing in school? And I think he ultimately says like, good. And ultimately, of course, uh, April's boss is like, yeah, he's doing so well that I have to make sure that he even goes to school. And that's when we get the transition where the kid sticks his head into the headphones that his father doesn't know about. So cue April trying to get some towels or something like that, and eventually, consistently, there are times when the turtles are hiding away, and then eventually you have to find a new convenient spot to hide because they otherwise just are not good enough at hiding. So we get to transition to where ultimately April is talking to Stern, ultimately talking about uh, police strategies and all of this stuff that actually makes no sense. How he's basically talking about police patrol units and a very bizarre like schemes of sorts that they're trying to do to bust crime and all of this stuff. And basically, she ultimately taking all of this and she's like, okay, could you say that again in English, perhaps? And he's like, what I'm trying to mention is everything uh, is in good hands. Everything is taken care of, and this and that. So basically, we have it to where eventually this report is over, and so April has to eventually again talk to Stern, and ultimately again that's where we get to where Stern is ultimately saying, "What's the point of you coming in here trying to bust my chops?" and ultimately, uh, like April throws some shade again, and then Stern throws into, "Are you going to tell me how to do my job?" And that's eventually when she walks out. 107, a new world record or new record. So we eventually have it to where, at this point, we Splinter. Where is he? How's it all going with that Splinter guy? So okay, where are we? So Splinter gone, and so and I think we've kind of nixed the entire foot thing. We've consistently like nixed the whole um actual Foot Clan portion of this. So let's get into it. So we have it to where, oh yeah, I remember now where now where we're going. So we have it to where showcasing the Foot Clan, eventually showcasing how great of a fun lifestyle that it is. And this is what we bow, 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 chicka bow, bow. We have all this cool music, and recently we have again Sam Rockwell coming in and eventually telling us anything you want to do it. Because ultimately everybody's having fun. We have um, Tatsu that is kind of coming in there, and people are bumping into him, and he's like, "Go play." And so recently, eventually, he'll fight some kid, and eventually, the kid will be really good, but then he'll say, "Never lower yourself to an enemy." And yeah, so we get to where Danny is going through and ultimately telling at some point where the turtles is or where the turtles are. But before we get that, we eventually get the first showcasing of the Shredder, and basically, he is telling us uh, that he wants every one of these kids to eventually become full members of the Foot. Um, and that money cannot buy the honor that each person earns tonight uh, of becoming a Foot member, and that everyone is here because the outside world rejects them, and ultimately that he is their father, or that this is their family, and that he is their father, and this and that, trying to manipulate and convince them that the Foot is a great place to be. So ultimately, we have Danny that is like master, and he raises his hand to ultimately tell Shredder that ultimately uh, the turtles are ultimately by April O'Neil's place because he had ultimately seen a turtle before. Because he had ultimately mentioned, because Shredder had ultimately mentioned that there are freaks out there that are trying to stop them. Um, Ultimately showcasing Splinter in the background, hidden away. So basically, what we have at first is okay. April is now at home, and she's reasonably going to showcase all the turtles her antique shop, her downstairs antique shop. But before that, we get April on the news again. That is ultimately doing a report talking about the Foot Clan on how Raph had helped her, and um, immediately the guys are like telling telling Raph that, oh, he's turning red and this and that. So eventually he throws a sigh on the floor, and they're like, oh, I guess maybe not. So eventually, Raph and Leonardo, of course, are butting heads because ultimately they're Raph wants to go and fight again. He wants to find out where Splinter is, and of course Leo doesn't know where Splinter is, and because they don't know where the headquarters are of the Foot. And so eventually having Raph, of course, just kind of getting frustrated, and eventually having Michelangelo and Donatello eating their pork rinds and going into the kitchen. And so Raph leaves ultimately to go into his roof to just kind of blow off some steam. So eventually, April comes home and she's looking for Raph because ultimately the news report and this and that. So she goes and she shows off all these antiques. Ultimately, Donnie mentions, "Oh, this place has everything." Again, April is still eventually asking for uh, when like Raph will be back, and Donatello's like, "Well, I'm sure he'll." Like he does this all the time. I'm sure he'll be back. Um, and eventually, Michelangelo, joking that he usually does, uh, smacks percussion cymbals right in front of Leonardo as April is kind of holding her ears, so that way she doesn't hurt her ears. So ultimately, eventually, again, April is still like, "Hey, Raph," and Donatello's like, "Yeah, I'm sure he'll be back any minute." Cue Raph falling through the roof, the glass roof like way thing, to fall onto the turtles, and so April, of course, asks, "Is he basically meaning he dead?" And Leo checks his pulse. He's like, "No, he's alive, barely." So cue all of the Foot starting to drop through this roof as well, and because ultimately, like, they go through the antique store, and Donatello says, "Oh my God, this place has everything," and so yeah. So eventually, the Foot guys drop through, and ultimately he's telling maybe this isn't the best time for all you buddies to kind of crash through here, but they do so anyways. So eventually they all start to fight it out, because at first there was a pretty good chucker there, a pretty good nunchucker, and so reasonably Mikey, of course, duels it out with this guy, and then ultimately tells him keep practicing because he sucks. So they all fight it out. Reasonably, we get one of the turtles gets shoved in a fish tank, and they spew out water in the face of one of the Foot. ultimately, Leo realizes that one of these guys knows where Splinter is, so don't knock them all out. So a lot of times we have it to where like Leonardo is like slicing the swords, and then eventually um, he doesn't slice the swords, and the guy dodges anyways, and he's like gotcha, and then he hits him, and he like hits him or kicks him or something like that. So eventually we get down to, of course, the Wheel of Fortune moment where ultimately Mikey uses his shell as a spinning device to ultimately knock everybody down. To where eventually both of the guys are on the floor, and the Foot decide to get these basetos, the weapons that look like axes, and so basically Michelangelo is like, or basically Mike, Donnie and Mikey are ultimately like saying like, I guess there's no Wheel of Fortune fans. Yeah, I guess not everybody loves Vanna. Or I thought, or no, wait, I think he says, I thought everybody loves Vanna. So we eventually now have these axe wielding things coming in, and eventually uh, Donnie is now trying to cut his way through some of these Foot Clan, and Michelangelo is telling them how crappy of lumberjacks that they would be. Um, that the only thing that would be safe in the woods would be the trees. And so we get it to where eventually these guys are chopping so many things up into the ground where everyone falls through the floor. And to where eventually they are just like, it gets to the point to where I think one of them has um, some kind of condescending thing to say, and then eventually they realize that Tatsu is there with another batch of Foot Clan, and so they're like, oh no. So they there is so many Foot Clan that eventually every single one of them are all getting outnumbered, to where even April has to have like a stick out to try and fight out some of these Foot Clan. So we get to the point to where like some of the guys are trying to grab things and throw at people. Michelangelo, of course, is using the percussion cymbals to hit people, and but again, everyone's getting outnumbered. It gets to the point where I think Donatello is getting smacked, or having his head smack against piano keys, and so I think at some point it gets to the one point where uh, Michelangelo is bopping somebody in perfect place, to where eventually it gets to the point where a little to the left, a little right, and one more time, and then April like smacks people with some stick and knocks them out. So eventually it gets to the point where everybody just gets so exhausted that eventually we cue Casey Jones. Casey Jones uh, had been watching Raphael from afar while eventually having some radio station at the very top of his I guess his apartment building. He had luckily, I guess, miraculously, like just been across his apartment building, seeing a big blobby looking turtle. But ultimately, once he put binoculars on, he realized, hey, there's a turtle freaking kicking and everything over there. Maybe I should go and check that out. So eventually, Casey Jones appears, and ultimately, he's like, whoa, who's the babe? And So eventually, the turtles are trying to figure out who the heck this guy is. The ultimately, it's like, who the heck is this guy? And ultimately, Michelangelo says Wayne Gretzky on steroids, and so ultimately Tatsu says attack. So cue everybody just fighting everybody, and luckily, because ultimately Casey opens with, "Hey, you guys hurt my little green friend over there," and so that I guess assumes that they are actually on his side, the turtle side. So it has it to where Casey is basically like beating the crap with a big hockey stick of all these Foot Clan, and so that's kind of putting the odds in their favor. It gets to the point to where April is like, you know what, we really need to get out of here. If anything, I have this little secret door for us to get out of, and so ultimately Leonardo is telling people, it's like, hey, we're getting out of here. And so reasonably Casey Jones is the only one left, and he's like, I'll cover you. So we ultimately find out that Stern had eventually called April's boss, ultimately at some point negotiating that that since Danny, uh, April's boss's son, is in prison, like, hey, how about like I negotiate to get your son out, but you gotta let April go. So we now get a message from I think Chuck or Charles or something, and he is basically telling April, um, via message, that she's fired, and basically she knows, and he knows this is coming as very much as a blow, and basically immediately when uh, he says that, the answer machine falls and hits one of the Foot Clan's head, and Casey Jones says, you're right about that, Chuck. And then eventually he leaves and he tells everybody bye. So eventually, having us now, queuing us down to reasonably get to the aspect of, okay, April is watching her antique place burn, and eventually she is heading to her barn that supposedly she hadn't been to in a very long time. But evidently, it's a very run-down bar. Nobody's barn. There's no one there, but evidently all of them, because evidently it's something that she probably didn't even know she had. Because this girl's a billionaire, I guess. So we are now having all the turtles at a barn, and so we get to the aspect of, it seems that eventually Danny is going to Splinter and repetitively going to him to just kind of look at him to ultimately uh see what he's about, kind of like see what's going on with him, because I guess he's kind of reveling in the fact that he basically found, uh he and some of the other Foot Clan had found this thing, and so ultimately Splinter doesn't talk for the Shredder, and ultimately when he's threatening him and everything like that, and he says nothing. But eventually, when this kid comes in, he eventually is willing to talk to him, lend a friendly ear. And Danny's like, "Oh, you do talk." So eventually, Splinter's ultimately telling telling Danny about, basically mentioning how uh, like, why is he kind of ending up here? Like, does he have nowhere else to go to? And Danny's like, well, my dad. And he's like, uh, all fathers care for their sons, uh, and stuff along those lines, kind of really coaxing Danny to go back to his father, and kind of, like, I don't know, like why is he here, and kind of like that, because ultimately, instead of Splinter being concerned about his own problems, of course, as per usual, he is caring about others and wanting to ultimately kind of mentor them, uh, and really help them through their struggles of currently whatever is going on. So, cue very much April at the barn, and ultimately Casey Jones is trying to fix the van. But so April is going, okay, how's the van looking? And ultimately Casey Jones is like, yeah, this van, it's like, it has a hole in the block the size of San Andreas, and basically the girl is like, well, okay, well, I need to walk. Like, I need to make my way to a landline because she has to call her boss. And immediately Casey Jones ultimately tells her, it's like, well, you won't need to do that, because reasonably he tells her about her getting fired on the phone. And so ultimately she's like, "Oh wow, that sucks," and basically he's just like, "Well," Casey Jones is basically just like, "Well, I saved you an 8 mile round tripper," and she's ultimately just like, "Well, thank you," and he's like. And then, like, there's this back and forth fighting about, like, no, thank you, no, I thank you, thank you, and then they both storm off, and then I think Donnie has like some like uh condescending thing to say or something like that. And so cue April like starting to talk about all the turtles, and talking about how they are kind of adjusting through them being at the barn, and that Leonardo is always with Raph. He's kind of watching over him, and that eventually Donatello has a person to cling on to, which is Casey Jones. They're ultimately fixing up some truck, and while they're doing that, they're having a name game alphabet thing where it's like they're starting at the very beginning of the alphabet, and they are trying to come up um, with alphabetical like hurtful things to say to one another. Like at one point, there's hose brains and gack face and this and that going on, and so we get to the aspect of Donatello ultimately getting this truck to work, but it works a little bit too well to where it almost runs over Casey Jones to where he has to hop out of the way. And ultimately, Donatello uh, freaking crashes through this place that this truck is in. And but Donatello's like, well, it works. And then ultimately, Casey Jones throws a uh, like a thing of cloth onto Danny's like, or on Donnie's like, hey. So eventually we get to the point to where April is mentioning about lingering thoughts remain and how basically everybody is very much at some point like reminded about the things that they have lost because ultimately at some point Raph eventually wakes up from being in the tub and eventually asks about when are we going to get some food around here, and then eventually Leonardo grabs him and ultimately says, like, hey, you know the thing I said about not needing you and all? And eventually they hug it out, and eventually Donatello goes in there, and April also does as well, and says that it's a Kodak moment, and they're like, what? So we get Raph back into the fold, and he's yelling out Splinter. So eventually we're getting to the aspect of all of the turtles are all kind of sparring, they're all fighting it out. Then eventually it gets to the one point where ultimately when the turtles are all playing like I think it's like a pop culture game where ultimately they're talking about what Russian novel uh and ultimately the answer is War and Peace. We have Leonardo meditating away, and ultimately he notices that he could channel Splinter, where ultimately Splinter is saying Leonardo. And so ultimately, Leonardo wakes from his deep meditation to ultimately tell the rest of the turtles that Splinter's alive, and Donatello's like, yeah, we all know is alive. Yeah, we all think that. And Leonardo says, no, I don't think, I know. And so ultimately, they get to the point to where they're all at this bonfire, and Leo is starting to tell them what to do, and Donatello's like, oh, well, I've come prepared, and he ultimately has marshmallows to roast against the fire, and Leonardo's like, put those away. So they all concentrate really hard, and so that cues the fire to turn blue, and then all of a sudden have Splinter come up as a very much like Star Wars spirited like thing. And ultimately, you have Splinter that is telling his sons how proud he is that they've figured out they figured out that nothing could stop them if they've all worked together, and that by true will and force that nothing is beyond their grasp, that they can like basically talk to people using force and will and meditation. Ultimately, Splinter has to kind of do this thing not knowing exactly where he's going to end up, and is basically telling his sons that he's so proud of them, and that he is going to uh, return one last thing, that he loves them all, my sons, and this and that. So Of course, we get that moment where everybody's sad and Michelangelo's crying, and this and that. So, uh, but anyways, yeah, very much kind of that interesting moment where it's kind of like the point where like the in the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie where they all get the like the gold or the different kind of Zords or whatever. That kind of moment is kind of like this moment where they all like go in a circle and hold hands, and then eventually channel their inter splinter. So yeah, kind of bashing that moment really through very much. Just getting through all that. So we eventually have them the very next day uh, having at some point where Casey Jones and April were at some point going like she needed his help for something, and then eventually he's like, "Hey, what do you want to help? What do you want me to help you with?" Like princess, babe, and all these other kind of terms of endearment. And eventually she's like, "You know what? I wouldn't ask you to help me if you were the last thing on earth." To where eventually, at some point, he eventually massages her. Eventually, at some point in this movie, we have April who is wanting ointment on her shoulders. Casey Jones grabs her and massages her shoulders with ointment. To where Mikey comes in and is gonna think about getting ointment, and instead he gets turtle wax, which is ha 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 big joke. So eventually, cue them finally realizing that it's time to go home, and immediately at some point Casey had broke this thing that both April and Casey are talking on, but evidently it's fixed now. Ultimately, it kind of goes into a very brief backstory of Casey Jones, where he did play professional, but then he got injured, and so cue them saying, and then Casey Jones, of course, telling him, "You know what? I hate that you do that," and so eventually they say, "We have to go back." So they go back. Ultimately, they go back to the sewer. And of course, Casey Jones does not like this because ultimately he basically hates every place that they've been to. And now this place is even worse. So Raph is already really quickly asking eventually when is the next time that they're going to fight it out, because ultimately he wants to find Splinter, but Leonardo's like, "Hey, let's not rush into things. We're not gonna like showcase to the foot that we're back just yet. Like we had a long road trip, and so let's kind of take it easy." Ultimately, to where they hear a sound, and ultimately it is Danny that is hiding in the sewer, and ultimately he's telling, "Don't shoot." And Raph is saying, "I don't think it's loaded, kid, because there is no gun." So eventually, we get to the aspect of Danny talking to April, and like eventually, she has sketches of the turtles, and eventually, Danny wants to keep one of these, and so we still have Casey Jones that is complaining about a lot of things, and then Donnie realizes that you're a claustrophobic, and Casey tells him, "Hey, do you want a fist in the mouth?" And ultimately, April is trying to explain to him like what a claustrophobic is because he doesn't know, and so eventually he is just like, "You know what? I'm gonna go and sleep in the truck." So he goes and sleeps in the truck, and so eventually, while everybody, all the turtles and everybody, all goes to sleep, eventually, um, Danny makes his way out to the Foot Clan again, and Casey Jones follows him because he realizes that he leaves. So he follows him to the Foot Clan. He's trying to kind of sneak in and figure out about this whole Foot Clan business. So eventually Shredder is talking to Tatsu at some point, and ultimately talking about their fighting style and how it's very familiar. And so eventually we have it to where uh, they're ultimately saying that they are going to uh, kill the rat at some point. And so Danny goes to Splinter, and then eventually Splinter tells Danny about Splinter's backstory on how, like, Splinter was the pet of Amata Yoshi, and so Amata Yoshi and Rokusaki were fighting over the love of some woman. And so eventually, Yoshi and this girl decide to run away with one another to, I believe, America. And Amata Yoshi, Owokusaki, found them, murdered the woman, and then the when Yoshi had come home from work, eventually Wokusaki murdered Matayoshi, and eventually Splinter had scraped his face, and Wokusaki sliced Splinter's ear. Uh, Pretty much quickly going through a lot of that, and then basically um, Danny asks what happened to uh, Wokusaki, and Splinter ultimately says, "I don't know, but you wear his symbol upon your brow," which was ultimately the bandana, making us realize that Splinter was the aftermath of this, or Shredder was the aftermath of this whole story. So eventually, we have to where the Foot is going to spring into action, and Shredder is going to come to fight the turtles himself. And so we have it to where Danny is kind of running out of the clan, or running out of the Foot Clan headquarters, and Casey Jones grabs him and ultimately takes off his mask and lets him know, because he ultimately is masked as one of the Foot Clan, but then eventually he takes off the mask and tells him, "Hey, do you remember me?" And ultimately Danny's like, "Hey, you have to come with me because they're gonna go kill Splinter." So Casey Jones follows him to Splinter's to start unhooking him, and so they start grabbing him, and ultimately Splinter says, "Who are you?" and Casey Jones says that he's a friend. Cue Tatsu coming to see Splinter. So Casey Jones ultimately is going to fight Tatsu, as well as eventually there being a bunch of different kinds of other foot quasi foot soldiers. So good God, we're almost spending like an hour, and we're almost spending the entire movie talking about the entire movie. So rush job now, I guess. Uh, Basically, we get it to where okay, Tatsu is now like taken care of because basically uh, Casey Jones is the because ultimately that's what Tatsu does. And then eventually Tatsu beats the crap out of Casey, but then Casey finds a golf club, and he'll never call golf a dull game again, as he swings away at Tatsu and beats the living crap out of him while saying four. So eventually, all the rest of the other quasi Foot Clan Eschlik members are thinking, "Hey, how about we get this guy? Like, what are we standing here for? Let's get him." And ultimately, Splinter ultimately says, like, uh, he's asking the kids, like, why are they there? Like, Splinter doesn't care about you or the people you hurt, and so that leads Splinter and Casey and everybody to leave without anybody attacking them. Q, uh, Q the Foot Clan going and attacking the the turtles at their sewer. Of course, basically, the turtles seem to have a master plan of when these people are coming to this lair, that they gas them all out and then beat the crap out of them. And then ultimately, Raph is eating an apple and he's like, oh, no more. And then ultimately, more come and he's like, okay, good. And then eventually, he beats the crap out of more of them. Eventually, he gets to a point where there is a skateboard where ultimately um, one of the turtles is knocking a bunch of the turtles off, a bunch of the Foot Clan out, and so eventually they make it to the surface, to eventually the turtles are all beating the crap out of the Foot Clan to the point where eventually uh, the turtles have to uh, dodge one of the attacks by putting their head into their chest and then coming back out again. And then they're like, man, I love being a turtle. So fights everybody, all the turtles fight, and then eventually get to some rooftop to eventually face the Shredder. So they they get to the aspect of okay, uh, basically Michelangelo throws a joke in about this guy never needing to find a can opener, and so eventually they fight it out. Individual ones, of course, I think Raph goes first. He gets taken out. Leonardo goes second. He gets quickly taken out. Then eventually, Donnie and Michelangelo have to match it for it. They kind of do paper rock scissors. Mikey gets picked, and eventually he has to wah his way. And Splinter is back with the turtles, and Casey Jones is looking at all the other Foot Clan, and he's like, "Yeah, I guess so much for family, right?" Because I guess all the Foot Clan is now realizing that being with Shredder was a sham. So Casey Jones is like, "Hey, maybe we should probably help your sons at some point," and Splinter is gone. So the turtles are uh, like exhausted and tired, and they're like, at one point, when did we lose control here? And ultimately, Leonardo comes to the consensus of like, well, if anything, this guy knows where Splinter is. And Shredder's like, oh, the rat, it had a name, or it has a name, or then it had a name. And then course, all the turtles get really angry, and of course, uh, I think Leonardo rushes him and then gets knocked out, and then his staff is to Leonardo's throat, to where ultimately everybody has to throw their weapons, but they still fight Shredder anyways, and so eventually Q to where Splinter is now on the rooftop, ultimately mentioning that it's Owokusaki, and remembering their backstory and this and that, to where ultimately Shredder is saying, now it's time for me to uh, finish what I began with your ear, and then he bum rushes him with his staff, but but Splinter has a nunchuck to where he can ultimately throw Shredder off the roof. So ultimately, here's when we get to Splinter ultimately telling Shredder when he dies that it'll be without honor, and him eventually falling from said roof into this trash compactor part of this uh, trash truck. So, because Casey Jones was taking out some leftover Foot Clan, but then eventually he notices that Shredder falls into this trash compactor like truck thing. So eventually he goes whoops and he hits a button for the trash to compact and whatever. So we get to the point to where everybody is like thinking they won, and so immediately they start again. The turtles are all like, "Yeah, we won!" So they're all like high fiving and this and that, and they're trying to come up with a catchphrase. And of course, Splinter so says, "I've always liked Cowabunga," and so of course they all high five in Cowabunga, and then they get to the point where it seems that the police are starting to arrive, and ultimately. Uh, uh, this is an all well and good moment. They ultimately have it to where now that Danny is eventually giving April back her money that he took from her earlier in the movie, and so eventually it gets to the aspect to where the turtles are watching over the rooftop and seeing the kind of conclusion of everything settling down. Eventually, Danny goes back to his father, and they kind of like hug it out, and eventually Danny tells his father that it's just Dan now, and he's like, Dan. And so we get to the point where eventually April is going to Casey Jones, and ultimately they're having their kissing moment, and reasonably like because April is at some point like looking and trying to make sure that her makeup and stuff is all right, because she has to go and quickly do a news report of what all had happened. And so eventually they have a kissing moment, and the turtles um, are basically like all excited that Casey's having his moment. All right, Casey, and all this stuff like that, to where eventually, uh, yeah, that's kind of like where they taper off and they end this movie. Again, trying to make this as quickly as done as possible, but kind of really going over the exact amount of time probably this whole entire movie was. So yeah, a very fun movie, but at the end of the day, who knows how much interest people will have in a movie that probably people already know about at some point. I try to bash through a lot of stuff, but then again, this took a lot of time to kind of get through, because I wanted to try as much as possible to get every notes hit and everything right for most of the point. But I wanted to try as much as possible to quickly go through things and yeah, and try to get my thoughts about stuff. But other than that, I'm gonna have to call this one a wrap because of how long it took. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.